Right. What is a external process and what are the agents involved in an external process? Here, there are some stages in external process. What are those? Those are weathering, erosion, transportation, deposition. These are the four stages we find in external process. These four stages collectively called denudation process. And this denudation process is a continuous process. At every moment, we find this denudation process. And this denudation process, also called erosion cycle or geomorphic cycle. Here, in denudation process, we find the leveling of the landforms. So far, we have studied how mountains and rocks rose up due to the internal process. And today we will see external forces like water and wind. Water and wind. These are the external forces we call works on the earth's surface. And these agents, what we call natural agents, wind and water are called natural agents. It works on the existing landforms on the earth's surface. So here, water and wind, that is air, works rigorously on the earth's surface and transforms the water existing landforms. These water and wind, by their interaction on the earth's surface, we find changes in the existing landform. These water and wind are called constructive and destructive forces because they construct some new landforms by their denudation process. And by their denudation process, they also destroy the existing landforms. For example, mountains may turn to valleys, and valleys may turn to plains. Plateaus may turn to plains. In this way, we see the landforms are going to be changed every time at every moment by the water and wind. So the shape of the lands transformed by the wind and water, and that what we call a third order of landforms. What is mean by third order of landforms? The shaping of the landforms by wind and water is called third order of landforms. So let us see that how this denudation process takes place, right? See, on the earth's surface, wind and water works as the wind blow and water flow. Here, water in the sense it is a river in the form of a river, in the form of a glacier, groundwater. Okay, all these are the forms of water. Wind in the sense it is a storm in the form of a storm, and gust. Okay, form. What is the form? Storm and gust. See, these are the another forms of the wind, storm and gust. River, glacier, also another form of the water. So water and wind changes the what existing landform, so that we call them constructive and destructive forces, and they work on the present landforms. They wear away the surface of the rocks and the mountains, and they transport the worn out particles and deposit them in lowlands. So what do we see are mountains and rocks surface is eroded by the blowing wind and water. So when wind blows and water flows on the surface of the earth, that is from the top of the mountains, on the surface of the rocks, they cut the surface of the rocks and mountains, and these cut off particles are transported and deposited somewhere, creating the land in the leveling process. So here the low-lying lands are leveled by the deposition of worn out particles, and this what we call leveling of the earth surface. What we call leveling of the earth surface. So leveling of the surface takes place by the natural agents like air and wind. Understand? So this air and wind works in many forms and changes the water existing landforms. So let us see that what is weathering, what is erosion, transportation, and deposition. Okay, and how the surface is transformed here. Okay, so your air and water. Air in the sense wind, and water, these are the natural agents just now we called, and also called it constructive and destructive forces. So air and water, when moves from one place to another place, there we see that the rocks from the molten material of the mantle, which are on the earth's surface, they are shaped into valleys and loose soils. River valleys cut into plateaus and plains by air and water. And hard primary rock, that means a large rock, a massive rock breaks into pieces by the air and water when hard primary rock exposed to the air and water. So this hard primary rock, we call it parent rocks, and the broken pieces from the hard primary rock transported by air and wind, okay, and deposited where the capacity of the air and water becomes low. So how the surface is transformed here by the air and water. Okay, we know that in the previous class we studied that second order of landforms formed on the earth's surface by the internal process, right? That is the rocks from the mantle. Look at here, this is the surface. What it is, a surface of the earth. Okay, On the earth's surface, we have seen that mountains have formed. It is mountain, okay? And this is the mountain formed when molten material erupted from the mantle. Now, on the earth's surface, what is there? Wind, that is air, and water is there. These two works on the mountain, on the rocks. We find some hills, rocks on the earth's surface. So these mountains, rocks, hills, everything on the earth's surface is exposed to the water and air. So when water flows down from the top of the mountain, it works on the surface of the mountain and cuts it. When the wind blows in this direction, that is the air, when wind blows horizontally in this direction, it also works on this mountain, and this mountain is shaped and re what you call it, shaped and changed its size into another one, that what we call plateau. The broken particles of the mountain are carried by wind and water and deposited here. Okay. For example, here the earth surface, how it is, this is the earth surface where mountain is there, and in another place there is a somewhat shallow basin is there, right? So these eroded particles of the mountain, hills and rocks are carried by the blowing air and deposited here where the shallow basin is there. So this shallow basin is filled with eroded particles and carried by the wind and water are deposited here. So the shallow basin of the land is turned to leveled one. So in this way, the earth's surface is transformed by the air and wind. Okay. And river valleys cuts into plateaus and plains. Okay. So how this works here, and what is that process we call here? Denudation process. And in that, certain stages are there, that is weathering, erosion, transportation and deposition. Let us see that what is weathering. Okay, now look at this slide. What do you see here? You will find here a rock. In the figure it is shown. So this rock is exposed to the water and wind. So when it is exposed to water and wind, it expands and contracts, okay, by the water and wind. Okay, see, throughout the year we find several seasons: winter, summer. In summer it is very hot, so the rock is exposed to sunlight, so it expands. And in winter it is cold, so that the rock contracts. So contraction, expansion, again contraction, expansion. Okay. And in that, the forces like wind and water works on that, and it gets what? Breaks. And gradually the broken pieces of the rocks are taken by the wind and water. So what is weathering here? The gradual disintegration rocks of rocks by atmospheric forces. What are atmospheric forces? That is wind, we call it natural agents, wind and water, right? So wind and water are called atmospheric forces. So wind and water works on the rocks due to the force given by wind and water. The rock primary layer, that means the top layer of the rock, gets breaks. It breaks up and gradually disintegrated into some small pieces, and that process we call here weathering. Understand? So what is weathering? The gradual disintegration of rocks by atmospheric forces is called weathering. So what are the stages in the weathering? In the weathering we find the rock hill is expanded and contracted. So when something is expanded and contracted, what will happen? We find it gets what? Brittle. That means cracks will come, and those cracks are enlarged by the chemicals present in the rock. And with the chemicals present in the rock, with the expansion and contraction, they break up into many pieces, where water moisture also acts on it. Okay, so when the rock is exposed to the water and wind, the outer layer of the rock is in different color with the internal layers. Have you observed that when you look at the hilly areas or certain rocks, you will find the top layer of the rock color is different with the inner layer of the rock, because the top layer is exposed to wind and water. Inner layer is not exposed to water and wind. So the color of the outer layer of the rocks changes due to the exposition to the water and moisture. Okay, so in the weathering process we see the color of the outer layer is exposed, color of the outer layer is changed uh, when with the internal layer of the rock. So this is the first stage in the denudation process, where the rocks are disintegrated by the air and water. Okay, then after this we find another stage, that is erosion. So what is erosion here? Okay, here wind and air. Wind in the sense storm, gust and steady winds. These are the changes of the winds. Now look at here. Wind may blow in the form of storm, means very fast blowing winds we call storms. Okay, and very fast blowing winds are called gust. If the wind blow with a constant speed, those are called steady winds. So wind in the sense air. Okay, when air blows very fast, air blows when very fast, it is a storm. Okay, more than very fast, it is called gust, and slow, it is a steady winds. Water, water in the form of rain, rainwater, river water and groundwater. Sea waves means it is also water. And glaciers, what do you mean by glacier? Where ice is accumulated over a period of time, the snowfall where it accumulates, it turns to glaciers. So all these are the different forms of the wind and water. So when I say wind and water, you should understand that wind in the form of storms, gusts and steady winds, and water in the form of rainwater, river water and groundwater and sea water, sea waves, then glaciers. So in all these forms, water and wind works on the existing landform. So let's see that what is erosion. Okay, so here winds wear away and cut away the rocks and the soil cover on the earth surface, okay, at higher places. So here erosion means it is the active wearing. What is it? The active wearing away of the earth's surface by moving agents like wind and water is called erosion. What is erosion? Active wearing away. See, erosion is uh, different from the weathering. What is weathering? Gradual disintegration of rocks, okay, by atmospheric forces. And what is erosion? Active weathering. Active wearing in the sense the weathering process becomes very active in the second stage, and it becomes active on the earth surface. Now look at here, this is the earth surface, the red line what I'm showing, it is the earth surface instead. So on the earth surface, what do we see? Wind and water. Okay, your hill is there, and here it is the plateau. Then it is a valley. Okay, so what will happen? This mountain is exposed to the wind and water, right? Similar thing what I said, but it is active, very active. Okay, so here the top of the mountains, top of the earth surface, top of the plateaus are exposed to the active wearing away by the wind and water. That is called erosion. Okay, so here water in the form of rain, river, flowing groundwater, sea waves, and glaciers. Wind in the form of storms, gusts, and steady winds instead. So in all these ways, we find erosion process instead. Look at the figure shown here. What do you see here? There is a hilly god section is there that is eroded, right? And it is near to the seashore, right or not? So here what happens, you will see that the wind passing from this direction erodes, weathers out and erodes this part, and the water, that is sea water, also continuously hitting this will leading to the breaking of the layers of the earth surface. So this landform is transformed into another shape by the water and wind. Okay. Now look at your another figure also given here. Okay. See, this is by the wind. Okay. Actually, the shape of the landform is in this way. What I am showing here, A, and this landform is exposed to the wind from all directions touching to this landform and working on it. So when wind blowing, the top of this landform is eroded and carried to somewhere. Okay, when the wind blowing speed reduces, the wind may not carry the particles with it, and those particles are deposited at another place. So here the shape of this landform changed to this one, which is shown here, B. Okay, so how the shape of this landform A changed to the B by the blowing wind. So here act 2, wearing away the top of the hills and earth surface is called erosion, and this erosion takes place by the air and water. Okay, so this is the second stage we find in the denudation process instant. The next is the transportation. Whatever the particles of the mountains and earth surface is eroded by water and wind, they are carried by the wind. Okay, so the small particles, that means small rocks, gravel, very fine and small uh, stone parts, and mud, that is very soft particles of the earth's surface, which are eroded by the wind and water. Fine soil, which are light in weight. All these are carried by the blowing wind. Okay, these all small rocks, gravel, mud, and fine soil carried by the wind and water. Where the wind and water velocity, that means the blowing velocity of the wind and flowing capacity of the water becomes low, then water and wind may not have the capacity to carry these materials to further place, and they deposit at that place instead, and that what we call transportation. It means that what is transportation? The eroded particles like small rocks, gravel, mud, fine soil. Okay, these are transported, means taken from one place to another place, sometimes hundreds of kilometers distance it takes place, and that what we call transportation. That means the worn out eroded materials which are carried by the wind and water from one place to another place is called transportation. This is the third stage we see in the denudation process. Look at here this slide. What do you see here? Here, the eroded particles are carried by the wind. Okay, these are the eroded particles. Here you see that a hole, right? Actually, the wind is blowing with high speed in this area, so that here the rock material is eroded and deposited. Okay, here where is deposited here? Here it is deposited. So the eroded particles transported from this place, that is A, and to this place, okay, B. So here the eroded particles by the wind are deposited here instead. So here these particles move from one place to another place, that is from place A and to the place B. So as it moved from one place to another place by blowing wind, it is called transportation. So the eroded materials blowing with the wind, moving with the wind from one place to another place is called transportation, right? This is the third stage we see in the erosion cycle, that is denudation process instant. And the last stage is deposition. Okay, rivers and winds, when they become slow, they does not have the capacity to carry the water, this mud, pine and silt, those materials carried and transported by the wind and river, wind and water is dumped at one place, that is called deposition. Okay, so when the river and winds slow down, they do not have the force to carry the material anymore, so that they dump. The dump means they deposit. Okay, so they dump the carried particles at a place, and that is called deposition. When it is deposited, every time we see that layer by layer by the deposition of the fine silt carried by wind and water leads to the formation of sedimentary rocks. Now look at this figure. What do you see here? In this figure, you see that the eroded particles by the wind and water are deposited here every time. See, my dear students, the four stages, that is weathering, erosion, transportation, deposition, all these four stages works at a time. Simultaneously they works at a different speed. Okay, in different places these are at a different rate, but this process is constant. That means at every moment we see all these four stages works out. So by the blowing wind and water, the eroded particles and transported deposited continuously here. So after some years, by the deposition of this silt layer by layer, okay, every time layer by layer deposited here and forms to the sedimentary rocks. So sedimentary rocks are formed in this way.